Well, welcome to today's workshop. We are discussing the Continuing Oral History Projects Grant, which is through the DC Oral History Collaborative. Um, we will go through this grant. We'll talk about Humanities DC. We'll give you all an opportunity to introduce yourselves. This session is being recorded, and we will send this out. Um, Let me see, let me make sure it's being recorded. Yes, it looks like it is. So this session's being recorded and we will send this out later this week. Yep, so as I said, we will do an outline or we will talk about Humanities DC. We will talk about the DC Oral History Collaborative. We will do an overview of the Continuing Oral History Projects grant and provide some examples of grantees who have completed this project. We'll offer you an opportunity to introduce yourselves, and then we'll go through the grant specifics and the application questions specifically. We will go into the actual system and show you the application and the questions. We will review components of a successful application, and then we will talk about the review process. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. You can drop them in the chat. You can also raise your hand or unmute yourself. And if you'd like to have captions on this recording or on this video rather, you can do so by clicking the More button and selecting to add captions. So my name is Leah Gage, and I am one of the community grants managers here at Humanities DC. I oversee a number of portfolios, but I am not the main point of contact for the Continuing Oral History grant. So I will ask my colleague Hillary to introduce herself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Hillary Steen and I'm the other community grants manager. And I am the main point of contact for COHP grant related questions. Thank you very much for being here today. And Jasper, if you want to introduce yourself too, or
Sure. Hi,
reintroduce yourself.
hi everybody. I'm Jasper. I think I know most people here, but I am the manager of the DC Oral History Collaborative. It's good to see you.
And Loy, if you'd introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, hello everyone. Lloyd Amar, Director of Grant Making and Programs. Nice to see some familiar faces.
Great. And together we are the grants team and also involved in the DC Oral History Collaborative, which we'll talk about. So here at Humanities DC, we are one of 56 state humanities councils. We represent Washington, DC, and we've done so for over 40 years. And really, we see our job as a convener and connector for curious people who have bold questions about the powerful stories of our city. And we do this in two different ways, basically. One, we have our own curated public programming that we do, and we work with other humanists throughout the city to help us put these programs on. We have a community journalism program, which connects individual community members who wish to write about stories in their community, and we try to connect them with publications and give them some training in journalistic practices. We have the DC Oral History Collaborative, which hopefully you all are familiar with, and we'll talk a little bit more about. Our monthly culture series, which is an event that we put on with other humanists throughout the city, kind of a panel style or presentation style event that presents different projects that other humanists around the city are working on, as well as fellowships to help us do our work. But the other thing that we do is we make community grants, and this year we will make just about $900,000 in grants to 50 plus grantees across 8 wards. And we expect to make about 5 continuing oral history project grants this year. So of our grants, three of them are closed. We had our first cycle of grant projects, and that closed earlier this spring. We have our Community Culture and Heritage Grant, our Visions Grant, and then the Oral History Interviewing Grant. We will reopen those again at the end of this year, most likely for the 2027 fiscal year. But currently, we have 3 grants open, and these are actually due May 1st by 5 p.m. And we have the Beyond the Archives grant, which is a DC Oral History Collaborative grant that enables folks to take oral histories out of the archives and present them in a public forum. We have our General Operating Support Grant for humanities nonprofits. And then we have the Continuing Oral History Project, which is what we'll be talking about today. We have all of these linked below on our website, which Hillary's showing us now. If you go to community grants at the top and then grant opportunities, you can see all of these outlined. We include the request for proposal, a PDF of application questions, links to the grant program workshops, and we encourage you to take a look at this website if you have more questions about any of our grants. And so before we move forward, I wanted to ask folks in the room if you all have thoughts about what the humanities are or how you would define the humanities.
If you have any definitions in addition to what's currently on your
Yeah,
screen.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel so guilty about always taking this question because I've attended so many workshops, but you always need someone to start talking first, right? So humanities are the discipline, the academic discipline of human beings, right? Our experiences, our history, our culture, processing that through like art and literature, philosophy, music, language, all of those things. Ultimately, asking the question, what does it mean to be human?
Mm, yep.
Yeah.
Great response. Yuki.
I've done this so many times, Leah, that
You know,
I
Ra,
feel
I
so.
appreciate you. I was looking to you and I thought,
I wanted Idris to do it this time.
well, Yuki dropped in a really good comment, stories of people by people, which I think is absolutely correct. I really like this last sentence here on this slide. They are a compass for interpreting what humans make and exploring what makes us human. And so the humanities basically provide a framework for us to understand human society, human culture, the things that we do and make. And so they do this through, there's usually a number of disciplines that are listed underneath the humanities. So we can understand our past through history, anthropology, and archaeology, the public expression of our story through literature and language, and art history, art theory, and art criticism, and the meaning of our story through ethics, philosophy, comparative religion, and the law. So we use the National Endowment for the Humanities definition of the humanities, and that is linked here in this presentation. When we send out the slides, you should receive this, and you can click on that link and review more if you'd like.
So many slash all of you already know why oral history is important, but just as a refresher, especially for those who are coming back into it after some time away, oral history is a very important tool that we have within the humanities. And it is a chance to deepen and complicate the written record of history, essentially. And it is a way that culture and values are shared to strengthen community and inform new generations over time. It is an interview-based method of producing historical documents for future generations. And it is a means of understanding experiences that produce perspectives different from one's own. So with oral history interviews, talking about people's life stories and how they intersect with historical events, or maybe vice versa, it is an incredibly important tool that we have, as you all know, in the humanities. And on the right side here, just some photos we have. So the DC Oral History Collaborative occasionally does pop-up events around the city where we kind of allow people on the street to conduct oral histories of their friends, of strangers, etc. And we do this routinely throughout the year. These are just 2 photos that we have, I believe, from 2 years ago. And hopefully we'll do these again once the weather gets a little bit nicer. And so just as another refresher part of this presentation, the DC Oral History Collaborative is a partnership that we have with the DC Public Library, and it provides various resources about the art and science of oral histories through grant making, training, and public projects. And under the DCOHC umbrella this year, we have 3 grant opportunities. One is oral history interviewing, which was back in cycle 1, like Leia said, for 2027. That should open in December of this year. And that is all about creating new projects and going through trainings about how to actually do oral history interviews. And then in cycle 2, so right now, currently open, we have our Beyond the Archives grant, which is doing public projects based off of interviews that are in archives, so taking interviews beyond the archives. And then finally, we have our continuing oral history projects that is now open that we are talking about today. So the Continuing Oral History Projects grant is only for specific DC-based individuals, community groups, and nonprofit organizations who have already completed an oral history project with Humanities DC, and in which at least one project team member already completed the full Oral History 101 workshop that all new DCOHC grantees attend at the beginning of the project period. So if you have been a grantee of ours between 2017 and 2025, you would be eligible to apply for this grant, again, as long as you already completed your project with us and at least one project team member attended that big series of trainings that all new grantees join for. And this grant essentially lets you continue those projects that would explore DC life, history, and culture through collecting and archiving new oral history interviews with people who have lived it. So continuing the projects that you have essentially already completed the first go around. All grantees must submit final deliverables, just like for your quote-unquote original DCOHC project. So that would include media files, transcripts, indexes, release forms, and metadata for each interview. And this allows us to be able to archive all of your interviews in the People's Archive at the DC Public Library. The maximum award amount for this grant is $8,000. However, you can also request an additional $5,000 to specifically translate transcripts as well into different languages. And we'll talk more about translation later in the presentation. And the project period for this grant is from July 1st, 2026 through March 31st of 2027, which means that all Humanities DC funds would be spent during this time period, and you would be done with most or all of your project activities as well. For some of you on this call, I know that you have already applied for funding in 2026. Perhaps you wanted to do a brand new oral history project, so you applied for oral history interviewing back in cycle 1. Just be aware that if you end up receiving that grant, or really any grant from cycle 1 of 2026, you are ineligible to apply for this particular grant. You will be notified if you get funding from cycle 1 before the application deadline for this grant application. But just be aware, if you get funded in cycle 1, you cannot then apply for this particular grant. So one example of a current grantee under this grant program is Charvis Campbell, and he is a music historian and record store owner. He started an oral history project back in 2022 that documented oral histories from the iconic Westminster Jazz and Blues program at the Westminster Presbyterian Church in Southwest DC. So this grant has allowed him to continue collecting new stories, new interviews that would be archived at DCPL based off of this one particular community. And so I want to move the camera over to you all for a little bit, for you all to introduce yourselves. If you're affiliated with any organization, you can talk about that as well. And also tell us a little bit about the project you're considering, and why you are interested in continuing your original project as well. So I'll stop sharing so we can look at each other for a little bit. If anyone wants to go ahead, you can just start talking or type in the chat.
I can go since I have to get going in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. My name is Yuki Kato, and I was a grantee of the previous year, 2025, for the project in which the oral history project in which I had I set up a intergenerational conversation between younger people and their elder family member or acquaintances regarding sort of the local food provisioning practices in Washington, D.C., sometime during the early to mid 20th century. And we were able to complete 7 sets of interviews, so 14 individuals included. And out of that came interest in potentially continuing and expanding, partly because the areas that we were able to cover was a little bit limited, and also we met a lot of people whose age did not quite match in their family members, and so we were trying to see maybe we can modify that requirement a little bit. But I was also able to bring in Shade Anderson is on this call. I'm not sure if Bailey Allen was able to join, but 2 of the people who were part of the original project would actually be joining me to apply for the expansion. So that's really what I'm after this year.
Great, thanks, Yuki. Anyone else want to introduce themselves?
Well, I will introduce myself. As I said earlier, I attend a lot of these workshops. I mean, I find them interesting. I attend because I fancy myself as being a storyteller, and I'm raw mean, a storyteller and a oral historian, and I like to see what are the possibilities that we can do with oral history. So I'm always interested. I feel like there's so many great stories to tell and so many great ways to tell it and so many interesting people out here that we need to get those stories. And I'm always looking to see how do we do that and how do we continue to fund those things. So whenever the opportunity comes up, for me or for other folks or for organizations and community groups that I'm working with here, that we're ready to move forward on it.
Great, thanks, Ra. Idris, if you'd like to say hello, you're more than welcome to as well. But absolutely no pressure.
Absolutely no pressure. Okay. My name is Idris Abdullah. I was born and raised here in the District of Columbia, proud graduate of DC Public Schools. Most of my career has been spent in housing and community development, financial empowerment, focused on traditionally underserved communities. I currently serve as an adjunct professor at the University of the District of Columbia, and I'm a public history graduate student. I'm probably the oldest grad student in America, but that's okay. I would rather exercise my brain the way others exercise their bodies so that I don't wake up one day staring off into space with dementia or Alzheimer's. So all of this is really about service. I mean, and the life has taught me that basically the real value of life is service. So this is an extension of that in my retirement years. Thank you.
Right. I will go back to sharing the screen. But thank you all for being here today. So the grant requirements for this particular grant might look very familiar to some of you. You would interview at least 5 new people over the project period. So you already did your project, you closed it out, perhaps you interviewed 7 people, for example, you would find 5 new people to add to the current archive. And there are 2 required reports for this grant. The first one is an interim report, and that is due on November 15th, so about halfway through the project period. And this is a pretty short report. It's where you would talk about how you have spent the funds so far and how the project is going, essentially. And before that particular deadline, all grantees will have one-on-one meetings with me and Jasper to talk about how things are going. We can answer any questions, offer advice as well. And we might have additional check-in meetings throughout the project period. But this particular check-in before the interim report is one of the requirements for this grant. And then the other part of this grant are all of the deliverables, like I mentioned earlier. Because some people, perhaps not on this call, but maybe if you're watching the recording later on, you might have stepped away from DCOHC for a bit and you'd like a refresher on these deliverables, we are more than happy to walk through them with you for sure. But the deliverables are due on April 30th of 2027, which is 30 days after the end of the grant period. We do highly recommend that you would be working on the deliverables throughout the project period, obviously, but you do have that extra month or so to really gather everything together if need be. And these deliverables would include the media files, the transcripts, the indexes, and the metadata, which should be familiar to many of you, definitely. Another deliverable is the release forms, which would assign copyright to DCPL and would allow all of the interviews to be publicly available. So once something goes in the UC Public Library, that means that all elements of that interview will be publicly available. If you have any concerns about the publicness of the project, definitely let me and Jasper know and we can walk through other ideas. But essentially, once things goes into the public library, then all elements of that project will be available for the public to peruse. Also due on April 30th is the final report, and that is where you would talk about how all of the funds from the project have been spent, and then do a project evaluation. So the successes, the challenges, things like that as well. All of the deliverables are prepared in a platform called Their Story, which allows you to collate everything into one particular database. Grantees have used it for the past few years, and it's a wonderful resource. And especially for those who don't have experience with Their Story, we can definitely walk you through how to actually use it. We do a Their Story training for the brand new grantees, for example, and we would be happy to invite you all as well. And so once you actually put the deliverables in Their Story, then we at Humanities DC would send these deliverables to the DC Public Library, where they would perform quality control on all of the deliverables. So they would look over formatting, spelling, things like that. And then they would be able to import everything into the People's Archive digital repository, also known as DigDC. And so once it's in DigDC, that means that everything is publicly available, easy to find into the foreseeable future.
So the time commitment ranges. It really depends, but grantees have let us know that it can take 20 to 50 hours per oral history interview because that entails attending refresher trainings if need be, conducting research and pre-interviews, creating your interview guide, scheduling and conducting the interviews. Many folks tell us that scheduling can be one of the biggest challenges throughout this process. Seeking narrator approval of transcripts, producing the index, producing the metadata, and administering the grant, meaning completing your reports, getting your receipts and your documentation together. Luckily, though, as Hillary said, their story is a really great resource, and it does help with kind of some of the initial transcribing and metadata collection. So it is a good resource, but this can be a time-consuming process. Just quickly, if you wish to apply through a fiscal sponsor, you may. Individuals can apply for this grant on their own and receive this grant without any kind of organizational sponsor or 501c3 status. However, if you do choose to apply with a fiscal sponsor, just note that the fiscal sponsor, which is the organization, must meet all of the eligibility requirements, meaning they must be DC based, they must be registered as a 501c3 here in DC. Then when they apply, they are the applicant. So they assume the application submission responsibilities, the acceptance of the funding responsibilities, and the distribution, as well as all of the report submission. No more than 10% of any grant may be used toward the fiscal sponsor's administrative fee. And the eligibility requirements for that are noted in the RFP. And briefly, I want to note Yuki's question here because I see that you're about to, oh, she may have jumped off. But we can address that a little bit later.
And we included the fiscal sponsorship slide in this presentation because if you originally had your original project as an individual, but you would now like to have a fiscal sponsor, you can. If you originally applied through a fiscal sponsor, but now you would like to be an individual, that's okay too. And if you have further questions about fiscal sponsorship and maybe you want to switch from what you originally applied as, definitely let me know and we can walk you through next steps for all of that. So before we go deeper into the actual application, are there any questions at this point?
So Yuki did ask a question in the chat, which we can address. How much modification, widening the age eligibility of younger interviewees, in my case, can be made to the original project? So really just seems like a question about modification of the original project as it applies now.
Yeah, so we will go a little bit over interest area once we get into the actual application. But basically, when you look at your original application and what you originally wrote, you are totally welcome to literally copy and paste what you wrote into this application if you would like, but you can also lightly edit it as well. Because the purpose of this project is to continue a project that you already did, but you are more than welcome to look at it from a slightly different angle, look at different communities, demographics. So in Yuki's case, if she wants to bring on board younger people that perhaps weren't part of the original project, that's okay. So we definitely ask applicants to not make too many major changes to it because at a certain point you'd basically be creating a whole new project. But little changes like age, that would be allowable. So now talking about the weighted review criteria. So the excuse me, Humanities DC broke down the application into 5 major sections, um, which kind of corresponds with the different application questions themselves. And there are slight differences in this weighted review criteria compared to the DCOHC or oral history interviewing grant, because for the continuing oral history projects grant, reviewers will see more of your application this time around. So a lot of it that's on the screen here may look very familiar to you, but there are a few small changes as well. So worth 40% of the reviewer score is the project description and timeline. And so this is basically what your project is. So this is where you talk about your interest area and making sure that it is focused and specific about what you hope to learn from narrators' memories and reflections. You would talk about why you want to continue the project, and you also would note your timeline. And so making sure that all of the milestones you would like to achieve is within the grant period and it's feasible as well. The next section is worth 15% of the score, and that's the contribution to DC history. So this is where you basically explain why your project is important to DC. It is totally okay if your interest area remains hyperlocal or small in scope, but you would explain here how and why the interviews would provide important human context to the history of DC and its residents. The third section is community collaboration, worth 25%. And this essentially looks at the outward facing elements of the project. So this is where you would explain how the project would be strengthened through collaboration and community involvement, and where you would talk about how you will find narrators as well. The next section is capacity and personnel, which is worth 10%. And this is all about who is working on the project. So the project director, for example, so the applicant would note how the project director would be motivated to carry the project to completion. If you are bringing on other team members, this is where you would talk about their role and why they were chosen as well. And the last section is the budget, which is worth 10% of the score. And this is where you would note all of the financial pieces of your project. So this is where you would describe how the Humanities DC funds will be used and making sure that all expenses are directly tied to the proposed project activities and that all of the expenses are allowable as well. So those are the 5 weighted criteria for this particular grant. Right, so I'm going to switch to a different screen now as we dive into the actual application. But I did want to note, especially for people who perhaps they took a break and they're coming back, we do have the grants portal instructions that is under the grant opportunities webpage. If you go to the right, grant portal instructions, and this lays out everything about the grants portal, for example. We ask for you to not create a brand new account. So if it's been a while since you logged in, you don't remember your password, there is a way to reset your password, for example. All right, so when you are in the grant system itself, you will be able to, find the application for this. And what you see on my screen right now is a little bit different from what you would see on your end, but I wanted to show the back end of this application just to show you all of the potential areas that you might see. Certain questions will only pop up based off of responses to previous questions. So some of these particular areas won't be applicable to you. But I wanted to show it all just to lay everything out. All right. So I'm not going to go through every single part of the application because it's kind of self-explanatory, but very quickly for the review process, we will talk more about the review process later, but essentially we work with external grant reviewers, so people who have strong connections to the humanities in DC to actually review your applications. So they are the ones who are looking through the weighted review criteria to determine if your responses actually align with those criteria. Then for applicant information, this is pretty straightforward. Like we talked about earlier, if you would like to submit through a fiscal sponsor, you would check off organization here. If you are applying on behalf of an organization that's not a fiscal sponsor, you would also check off organization here. And again, if you do have questions about the fiscal sponsorship, just let me know and we can walk through it together. So the applicant would note where they're actually located in DC, how they found out about this grant, and then talk a little bit about any grant experience they have with Humanities DC in the past. This particular question is one of the few that reviewers do not see. This is just for us on the back end to basically remember how we worked with you for your previous grant and your experiences with that grant as well. If earlier in the presentation you checked off that the applicant is an organization, then this section will pop up. And this talks about the mission statement of the organization, how the project will support that organization, etc. If you are applying as an organization, you have to be registered in DC. However, if you are incorporated in another state outside of DC, then you would upload your DC registration here. And if your organization is not only registered in DC, but incorporated here as well, you don't have to upload anything here. So this is only if you're considered a foreign entity. And then if you are a fiscal sponsor, so the actual organization that's applying is a fiscal sponsor, you would check off yes here. However, if you are an individual, as you can see, there are fewer questions here, and this is just where you would note your proof of age and DC residency. So all individual applicants have to be at least 18 years old and be a DC resident. So you would upload proof of those two elements here. If you are applying through a fiscal sponsor, this is where the fiscal sponsor would talk about who or what they are sponsoring. So this is where that sponsored entity, this is where their name would go, their address, their ward, etc. And also the fiscal sponsor would basically make it very clear that they understand what they're getting into as the grantee, more or less. And so we have a template here for the fiscal sponsor to fill out, but they're more than welcome to create their own document as well, as long as it hits on these 4 bullet points. Okay. So then the first major section, which is one of the weighted criteria, is a project description and timeline, which again is worth 40% of the score. You would note how much you would like to request for the funding. Again, you can request up to $8,000, but if you would like the translation enhancement to translate transcripts, you would add however many dollars for that as well. So if you would like the full dollar amount, you would put 13,000 here. etc. And down here is the interest area. So like I mentioned earlier, you can just copy over the same exact interest area that you used in your original application, or you can copy it over and lightly edit it. For example, if you wanted to approach it from a new angle, interview people from different demographics, things like that. And something to keep in mind as you're going through this whole application is that reviewers are likely going to be completely unaware of your original interest area. They wouldn't know that you interviewed 7 people previously or whatever. So as you're writing your application, just keep that in the back of your mind that like you might remember that, oh, I did this project. Reviewers will definitely know about this project. Humanities DC knows about this project. But in all likelihood, the reviewers who are actually looking at your application probably won't know anything about your original project. So especially in this interest area box, just keep that in mind as you're writing through the application. And then down here is the reason for continuation. So why you actually want to work on the project, more or less. So perhaps there were topics or themes that you weren't able to get through during the initial grant period. Maybe there are individuals who you really wanted to interview, but you couldn't, but now you have the chance to. Or perhaps adding additional interviews will help with future humanities projects, add more to the historical record, things like that. So you would note that in this box here. And you will notice that with many of the questions, or at least all the ones with the text box, there is a character limit. You are more than welcome to use all of that space, but you don't have to. It doesn't really matter if you write up to, in this case, 3,600 characters or just like 200 characters. It really doesn't matter. But we allow that kind of leeway based off of, people have different writing styles. Then here is where you would put how many people you would like to interview. Like I mentioned earlier, all projects must interview at least 5 people. It ends up that grantees usually interview between 5 and 10. But, as experts on this kind of project already, you know how much time it takes. So, just figure out for yourself how many interviews you realistically hope to finish, basically. Then the timeline down here is where you would note relevant dates and milestones about successfully carrying out the project during the grant period. So this is one of the newer questions that reviewers will see. You might remember, especially if you were a 2025 grantee, that reviewers did not see the timeline, but now as a continuing oral history projects applicant, they will see this part of your application. So that's why the timeline is now part of the weighted review criteria. Humanities DC funds can only be spent during the project period, so between July 1st of 2026 and March 31st of 2027. And it is totally possible if your project extends beyond that grant period, or maybe you started earlier than that, but the funds that you would receive from Humanities DC would have to be spent only during this time period. And if you would prefer to upload a visual timeline, you're more than welcome to as well. If you wanted to note everything in an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document or something, that's totally okay as well. Next is the contribution to DC history, which again is worth 15% of the total score. And this is where you would describe the importance of preserving these stories to continue this project. for future researchers, residents, and the general public. The next section is around community collaboration, worth 25% of your total score. And so you would fill out these target audience demographic questions. So the range of your target audience, so perhaps like the age of the narrators who you're hoping to work with, as well as the race and ethnicity, and where people live, essentially. And for these 3 questions, you can check off as many boxes as you deem appropriate. Next is the community involvement and recruitment section. So this is where you would talk about how you will involve the community in your project. And ideally, community members should be involved with the project beyond just being interviewed. So beyond just having their stories archived. So perhaps the community members can connect the project director to additional narrators. Maybe they will help with publicity and general outreach. Maybe they can assist in finding locations for where the interviews will take place. Things like that. And also in this section is where you would explain your recruitment plan for finding narrators. It is totally okay if you don't have individuals to name at this stage of the process. But as long as you are thoughtful about where you hope to find people, that is totally okay as well. But we do ask for you to at least note your idea for how you will find additional narrators here. The next section is around translation, and this is a little complicated, so bear with me. So this is where you would note what languages your interviews will be conducted in, and if you would like to translate those transcripts into another language. We prioritize if a project involves interviewing narrators in a language other than English to receive the translation enhancement. The DC Public Library requires that all transcripts are in English for archival purposes. So if you want to interview people in Spanish, for example, you would check off this box. You would check off this box because you would plan to translate transcripts into another language. And if that shows up, then this box will pop up, which explains that since you hope to interview narrators in a language other than English, you are eligible to receive the translation enhancement. Again, because it is a requirement for the transcripts to be in English. And if your project is then chosen for funding, we'll be back in touch with you about next stages related to that. But if you are interviewing people in English instead, but you still want to translate your transcripts into another language, then this box will pop up. And this is where you would list the language or languages you want to translate your interviews into, and also kind of explain your reasoning why. So perhaps you are interviewing a particular neighborhood in DC. All of the interviews will be in English, but you would like the transcripts to be more accessible to that community. So you would like the translation enhancement to create transcripts perhaps in Spanish, for example. So this is just where you would explain that here. Like I mentioned earlier, we will prioritize projects for the translation enhancement in which the interviews are happening in a language other than English because of that DCPL requirement. But as funding allows, we might be able to go in the opposite direction as well. And also, obviously, if you wanted a mix of languages in English and not English, then you would check off both boxes here, and we would move forward from there. And if you don't plan on translating transcripts into another language at all, then you just check the no box here. So the next section is capacity and personnel. So the next weighted criterion, which is worth 10% of the total score. And this is where you would talk about the project director, for example. So as a reminder, the project director is the person who's essentially in charge of the project. So they drive the actual project activities. They're usually the point of contact for programmatic purposes as well. And so in this box, the project director would explain why they want to continue the project. So this is where you can talk about your experience working on the original project, for example. Perhaps you've done other kinds of research into the topic area. Maybe you are connected very closely to the community in question. Anything else like that that kind of connects you to the project. And this is where you would talk about your passion as a project director. Like, why are you really excited to work on this project and continuing to conduct these interviews? And also in this box, this is where you explain the project director's role. So would the project director be the one doing all the interviewing? Would they be the one to do all the scheduling? Things like that. And if you would like to work with other team members, this is where you would note them here. You don't necessarily need additional people on this project. Most projects do benefit from having additional people. So the project director wouldn't have to do everything by themselves. It might increase community buy-in, things like that. So this is where you would name people, or at least the roles they would play as well. And since you are all continuing previously funded projects, you don't necessarily have to work with the same team members as you did earlier. You're more than welcome to. But if you would like to switch the people around, change the roles, not work with any team members anymore, that's totally okay as well. And something to keep in mind, the other side of the eligibility criteria for this grant, like I mentioned, is that at least one project team member attended that 3-day training workshop for new DCOHC grantees. So that could have been the project director who attended it previously, and or other team members as well. And we ask for this because that particular training not only goes into how to conduct oral history interviews, but it talks about all the deliverables as well that grantees must submit. So we find it just extra helpful if at least one person who's working on the project has already been through that training. Then the next section is the budget, which is worth 10% of the total score. And you might remember from perhaps if you're a 2025 grantee that reviewers did not look at your budget. But now, as a COHP applicant, reviewers will look at your budget. Like you used to as a grantee, you will still be able to update your budget throughout the project period as well. But at this point, since we all expect you to understand all the financial pieces of what goes into this kind of project, reviewers will be looking at it. And so with this particular column here, this is where you would note where you hope all of the humanities DC grant funds to go. And there must be a dollar amount in every single box in this column. If you don't want to spend any money in one particular or in any of the budget categories, that's totally okay. You would just write 0. So maybe for supplies, you already have the microphone, you don't need to buy anything else, then you would just write 0 in this box, and that's totally okay. You are more than welcome to put an actual dollar amount in every single budget category, if that's applicable to you, though. So just going line by line. The honoraria, we consider these to be like stipends of sorts that are usually paid to the narrators or community participants. Whereas salaries and wages is typically what's paid to the project team members. So this is the project director and any team members or collaborators. And we separate out honoraria from salary because, again, honoraria is usually considered to be for stipends for narrators, but you are more than welcome to put personnel expenses in whichever budget category is comfortable for you. We know that some all-volunteer organizations might feel uncomfortable putting personnel under salaries and wages, and that's totally okay. Just put it wherever you deem most appropriate for you. Supplies is any tangible object, basically, so this might include microphones. If you are filming your interviews, then maybe video cameras, that would go under here. For translation enhancement, this is if you would like that translation enhancement to translate the transcripts. And again, you can request up to $5,000, so you would note that here. And then other is anything else that doesn't fit neatly into any of the other budget categories. We do ask for you to not just plop a lot of money into the other category and note it as like contingency funds or just in case, or you'll move it around eventually later. We ask for you for the budget table to really try to be specific and to not have any kinds of like contingency plans necessarily. Because again, you will be able to move money between budget categories if you would like. That's totally okay. And then down here is a budget narrative, and this is where you were describing how all of the funds that are listed in this column here will be used. Make sure that all expenses are directly tied to the project activities. All expenses are allowable. I will talk more about allowable expenses in a little bit. And again, just be as specific as possible. It is totally okay to put lump sums and or calculations, but just make sure that you are as detailed as possible in this section, and make sure that everything you write here corresponds with dollar amounts that are in this column up here. For this second column, the cost share, this is where you would note other sources of funding if you have. It is definitely optional. You don't need other sources of funding, but if you're expecting it, or if you definitely have it, then you would note that here and explain a little bit about those additional funds down here as well. Having other sources of funding won't make your application stronger to the reviewers necessarily. They do appreciate that if you do have other sources of funding, you obviously explain what that is to have buy-in from other funders, but again, it's not required at all. Then down here is the community shareback session. This is something that is very optional. Grantees are allowed to budget a little bit of funds to a semi-private event to share collected oral histories with narrators and their loved ones. This is not a big public event for sure. It is really to bring the narrators together, essentially. And if you wish to do that, just explain your ideas here. You are allowed to budget a small dollar amount for the shareback session. But again, the focus of this grant is to continue to collect and archive oral history interviews, not do a big public event with it. And so regarding the budget, I will now go back to the slides to talk a little bit more about allowable and unallowable expenses. This is all noted in the RFP, the request for proposal, but just briefly. This grant program can fund a bunch of things, including personnel expenses, recording equipment, space rental, transportation, and more. Their story, like Leah mentioned earlier, is a great resource that can actually help with certain elements of your project, including transcription. And you can record interviews directly with their story as well. So you are welcome to put aside additional funding for something like transcription or virtual recording platforms. But their story is a great resource as like a first pass for these two elements of the project. So you don't necessarily have to budget for that if you don't want to. This grant program cannot fund a few things. So basically any non-program related costs, so anything that has nothing to do with the actual project, as well as any kind of general operating expenses. So general office supplies, rent, utilities, things like that. And then across the board, humanities DC funds cannot be spent on food and beverages, tuition and scholarships, debt reduction, regranting, or funding to government agencies. So if you hope to like buy food for your narrators during the interviews, you're welcome to do that. You just can't use Humanities DC funding for that piece. Another thing that this grant program cannot fund is any interpretive works based off of the oral history interviews. So this might include films, books, exhibits, big panel discussions, and more. If you are interested in doing something like that, we have a whole other grant opportunity that is all about that. It's called Beyond the Archives. More information about that is on our website. But this provides funding for you to do some kind of big public-facing project based off of the interviews that have been archived already. Earlier this week, we did a workshop all about Beyond the Archives, and that will go onto our website soon. And we're happy to answer any questions about that one as well. Then going back to the application, the next section is ADA compliance. This section will only pop up if you are an organizational applicant that has at least 15 staff members. So this section is for us to determine, or really to make sure that the organization is compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is where the organization would talk about accessibility plans, physical accessibility, and presentation/communications accessibility. And even if this particular section does not pop up for you in your application, maybe you are an individual, maybe your organization is too small, we recommend that you still think about accessibility in your project. So perhaps like how you will communicate with your potential narrators, where the interviews will happen, things like that. The next section is the appendix. This is totally optional, but this is where you would put any additional supporting documents for your project. You have space here, and you can also upload files as well. So this is where you can respond to questions over video if that's just more comfortable for you. This is where you can upload letters of commitment, from people, any resumes, things like that. We ask that things that are in this section, unless of course you're responding to questions over video, to be documents that support the application and not necessarily bring too much brand new information. Reviewers will see this section of your application, and there have been some situations in which applicants would upload documents to the section that don't correlate with anything that's written earlier in the application, so that causes a little bit of confusion. So whatever you upload or type in here in the appendix, make sure that that really like supports your application rather than adding too much new information. We also recommend that anything you upload here should be relatively short-ish, so like under 20 pages or so, or short videos, just because since reviewers are looking through all these applications, if you upload something that is 3 hours long or 50 pages, then they might not really be able to absorb all of the information that you're providing to them. So just keep that in mind, that things should be on the shorter side. Um, so since you have already done oral history interviews previously, instead of uploading like the full 2 hour interview, for example, maybe you can upload like short clips of it. That's just one example. Also, we tell reviewers to not do any outside research on your project, your organization, etc. So if you would like to put any websites or social media handles, the appendix is where to put that. Because unless you put like your website into the application, then reviewers will not see the website. Then the very last section is actually signing off on the application. So this would be the authorized signature. So with the organizational applicants, it would be whoever is authorized to sign off on grant proposals, and they would put their job title here. If you're an individual applicant, then you would just put your name here, and that would be that. And you can't really see it on this view, but at the bottom of each application, there are going to be two buttons. One is save and one is submit. We highly recommend that as you're working through your application, just continuously click the save button, like anything else on the internet. Applications are not automatically saved in the grant system. You have to just keep saving it, basically. And once you are done with it, then you would just click submit and then it would be submitted. It is totally okay to work on your application one day, save it, and come back to it days later. You don't have to all do it in one setting if you don't want to. Right, so before we go into tips for successful applications, are there any questions at this point? All right. Then we can move right along.
Okay, so Hillary presented the weighted review criteria, and when you're thinking about a successful application, really do refer back to that. But some key things to keep in mind. Make sure you have a very clear and detailed interest area. As Hillary said, reviewers may not be familiar with your past project that you're continuing, so making sure to reiterate that. Provide a compelling contribution to DC history. Make the case why you need to conduct additional interviews and why these are important. Ideas and explanations about how to connect with community, including narrator recruitment. That kind of specificity about how you will recruit narrators is really important, as well as your motivation for why you want to continue this project specifically. What's your motivation, and making sure that shines through. Personnel roles are defined. If you have additional team members, ideally you have mentioned them by name, or you've given a plan for how you will recruit those team members if you don't know who they will be. Only request funding for collecting and archiving new oral history interviews. This is key. So as Hillary said, this is not a grant that is maybe used to conduct interpretive works, events, public forums, documentaries, things like that. We do have a grant called the Beyond the Archives grant, which can be used to take the oral histories that were already conducted through your past project and interpret them in some way and present them to the public. This grant is specifically just to collect new oral histories as part of your previous collection. So you may not use it for hosting public events, creating podcasts, editing videos, etc. Overall, just make sure that your responses are detailed. Assume that the reviewers have no prior knowledge of your project. They may not have any idea about the narrators that you are hoping to recruit and the stories you're hoping to tell. So make sure to include those details, and if possible, have an external set of eyes review your application to make sure that it makes sense. Common application issues that we see through this grant is that, as we've said a few different times, applicants may assume that reviewers know about their original project. And so make sure to reintroduce your project as if you were doing it for the first time. There may not be any clear explanation of the importance to DC history. That's important to include. There might be an unclear description of your community involvement or narrator selection. It may not be specific enough as to how you will recruit narrators or how you will ensure that community members are a part of this project. And it may look like the application was written in a rush and therefore not detailed. So do make sure to give yourself enough time. Make sure to go into the grant system at least ahead of time before the deadline to make sure that you're familiar with it. We find that when folks try to do it in a rush and submit at the very last minute, there's a lot more opportunity for error and issues with submitting through the online system. So, any questions about any of this as we move on?
No questions for me.
Okay. All right, well, we'll continue moving through. So the application review process, if you've been through this process, hopefully you're a little bit familiar with it. So all submitted applications are reviewed by staff for eligibility. We simply look to make sure that applicants meet our eligibility requirements, meaning that they're DC based, that in this case, they're previous oral history collaborative grantees, and that they've conducted successful projects, and that they're in good standing with Humanities DC. So we do that as a staff, and then we assign the applications to panels of reviewers. We divide the applications into different panels based on subject area, perhaps based on if it's organizational applicants, then we may do it by the size of the organization or try to have organizational applicants on one panel. Reviewers are community members. They are individuals who are basically volunteering their time. They may have strong connections to oral history or other aspects of the humanities in DC. And they take the review criteria that we presented earlier and score the applications. And they do this using the scoring criteria that we presented earlier. So it's a very transparent process. And this generally takes about 3 weeks. And then they all meet together in panel meetings that last about 3 hours. And they go through and they discuss together. So they've reviewed them in private by themselves, but then they have an opportunity to discuss with their fellow panel members. This is a really great process, and it often results in really interesting discussions. Reviewers often will change their scores based on these discussions. It's a wonderful experience, and it really is kind of a humanities exercise in and of itself. So if you're interested in being a reviewer, if you've been an oral history collaborative grantee in the past, we strongly encourage you to consider being a reviewer in the future. You can still apply to be a reviewer as well as apply for a grant. We wouldn't have you review in the grant program that you're currently applying to because we wouldn't want that to unfairly influence, but many reviewers are also applicants in other grant programs. So once the reviewers have moved through their 3-week process, we as staff review the likely grantees. We select the top scoring applicants in each panel, and we make sure that their projects are eligible. We make sure that they are in good standing. We review for risk assessment. We will do a search of news stories and other things just to ensure that we're being good fiscal stewards of the grants. And once this is complete, we send the slate of likely grantees to our board of directors. They do not vote on whether or not to fund these applicants. They are not choosing the grantees, just as we do not choose them. But essentially, they are reviewing the entire process. We send as well a memo that goes through our entire application and review process from the moment that we advertise the grants all the way through the end of the process. And they basically are voting to affirm that, yes, we followed this process as presented. We held a public grant review process, and these are the likely applicants that were selected as a result of that process. So funding decisions are sent out about 10 weeks after applications are due. And we try to meet this deadline, if not be ahead of schedule. We think that it's important to get through this application process and review process swiftly and ensure that applicants are informed as soon as possible. Once grantees receive their funding decisions, they need to take a few steps, such as submitting a clean hands, signing their award acceptance form, and sending us their banking information if they haven't done so already. And so they generally receive the funds within 2 weeks after they're informed. So again, we try to keep this a very swift process. If you're interested in reviewing applications, we have a lot of information on our website about this. We have an intake form that we use that's also in the grant management system. So if you go to our website here under Community Grants, select Become a Grant Reviewer. And this walks through the whole process. We have a gathering every summer with reviewers and grantees so that they can meet one another. It's a really fun thing to do. It's a great professional development exercise. It's also a really great way to get a sense of how successful applicants are selected, so that if you're interested in being a grantee, you can get a sense from the back end of, okay, what's this process look like and who are the people who are reviewing my application? So there's an intake form listed here. There are instructions for completing the form. And if you want to take a look at the training that grant reviewers receive, that's also available here as well. Hillary is generally the main point of contact for reviewer-related questions, but you can reach out to either of us at any time.
And that's the app. That is the presentation for today. So we provide several resources to potential applicants, including virtual office hours. So this is where you would have a one-on-one meeting with me or Leia to go through your application, basically. So if you have any questions about eligibility, about application questions, things like that. And on our website, if you go to the grant opportunities page, the link to sign up for office hours is right over here on the right-hand side. Also, in this portion of the website, we have the FAQ document, recorded grants info sessions, because we earlier this year and late last year, we did info sessions that went over all 6 of our grant opportunities. So if you'd like to learn more, you can scroll down to the bottom of the page and watch the recording for that if you're curious. We have done grant specific workshops. This is actually the last one of 2026. So we have done 6 at this point, different grant program workshops that was basically followed the same format that we did for today. So it goes into each application, eligibility criteria, etc. So if you would like to watch any of them, they are there as well. Another resource that we provide is draft review. So if you would like us on staff to review your application before it's actually submitted, we can. To do that, you would put all of your responses into the grants portal and click save. And then you would let me and or Leia know that you would like us to do a draft review. And at this point, we would basically be another set of eyes on your application. We can suggest edits for it, or like if any elements of your application are a little unclear, things like that. We won't be able to tell you if you will definitely get funded or not because we have that external review process, but we can definitely take a look before the application is actually submitted. And be aware that if you're interested in draft review, you must let us know by April 24th, just so we have time to review your application before the deadline. And then down here is sample application responses. So these are exemplary applications from previous years. As you can see, we don't have one specifically for a COHP applicant at this time, but I do recommend taking a look at these three that are in the system. Most of what is in the oral history interviewing grant application, those questions are in the COHP application as well. But for elements around like budget and timeline, for example, then CCH Envisions might be able to help with that as well. So I think that elements of all three might be helpful for you as you go through your application. And then also we have Leah and I, our email addresses. There is also the general grants email as well. We look at this grants email every day, so it does not just go to the ether. Leah and I both have access to this inbox, but if you would like to email us individually, our email addresses are here as well. So with that, that is the presentation for today. So are there any